Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. Today we're talking about and taking a deep dive into the 2005 British horror movie, The Descent. The Descent was written and directed by Neil Marshall, who had previously written and directed the 2002 Dog Soldiers, written and directed a segment in the horror anthology Tales of Halloween, and directed the 2019 Hellboy remake. The Descent was filmed on a budget of £3.5 million and made $57.1 million at the box office. While the majority of The Descent is set in America in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, they actually shot the whole film in the UK. Exterior shots were filmed in Scotland and Ashridge Park in Hertfordshire, and the caves and interior shots were filmed on sets built at Pinewood Studios in London. Neil Marshall had gone caving with a group of about 10 people prior to filming to get a feel for what it would really be like for the women in the story, and realised very quickly that it would be far too dangerous to film in real caves. An article in Cinephilia and Beyond credits Neil Marshall with, quote, having the chops to revive British horror, end quote, with his 2002 Dog Soldiers. Now, personally, I think this is a bold statement, considering we also had Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later the same year and Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg's Shaun of the Dead in 2004. But whether or not Marshall is responsible for the successful revival of British horror in the early 2000s, one thing is sure. The guy knows how to make a solid and lasting horror movie. While not many people may necessarily know of Dog Soldiers, there are plenty who know and remember The Descent. In fact, I think it's safe to say The Descent could possibly join the likes of The Ring for being some people's that movie. You know, the one that traumatized you, the one that never really left the recesses of your brain. On its release, The Descent received positive reviews from audiences and critics alike. It has gone on to become a bit of a cult classic, and yet can also be seen frequenting many top horror movie lists for best horror movie or scariest movie moment. I personally watched it for the first time back in 2005, and its feeling of claustrophobia was so effective that while I loved the film, I never wanted to watch it again. But here we are in 2023, and I've rewatched the film, rediscovered my love for it, and now we're taking a deep dive into the movie, its characters, and its many varying interpretations. Before we start, just a heads up that this episode will include spoilers for the movie, so just bear that in mind if you haven't seen it yet. So, at first glance, The Descent has the appearance of a classic monster movie. I mean, it has all of the ingredients. A group of ready-made victims who enter into the natural habitat of a creature, who then proceed to be killed off one by one. Check, check, check. The film follows our final girl, Sarah, good name, who loses both her husband and daughter in a tragic car accident in Scotland. 1 year later, still suffering from this incredibly traumatic event in her life, Sarah reunites with 5 friends in America, and the 6 women head off on a caving expedition into the Appalachian Mountains. But things go very wrong very quickly, and halfway through the film, the women and the audience are introduced to the movie's monsters, the Crawlers. I think what helps The Descent stand apart from other modern horror movies is the use of practical effects over CGI, especially considering this film was made in the early 2000s, let's be honest, the home of CGI. As I mentioned, the caves in The Descent are all practical effects, and while there are 20-something different sets, each one is made up of the same pieces that were then carefully moved and reused, and the crawlers' makeup and prosthetics are incredibly well done. Yes, there is 1 or 2 scenes where CGI is used, for example, when multiple crawlers are moving along the ceiling of the caves, but the use of practical effects allows the film to feel more genuine and also age better. What's also interesting about The Descent is that while it does have the monster movie element to it, the truth is the monsters don't appear until halfway through the film. The horror has actually already set in before the monsters have even appeared. The 6 women have found themselves in a cave system which is undiscovered and unmapped. They then have to face the reality that they could be trapped in these caves forever as some of the tunnels begin to collapse on them. Panic, anger and claustrophobia all set in, and their situation is then made worse when Holly is injured, and now they have to find a way out of the caves while carrying her. By the time the monsters show up, the women and the audience have already had a terrible experience. The monsters only add to that. They don't create the horror. They simply make a bad situation a terrible one. So yes, The Descent is a monster movie. However, as with many of the best horror movies, The Descent's horror can be found in the multiple layers found within. The Descent is so scary because it almost explores fear itself in all its multifaceted glory, whether that's small spaces, being trapped, being eaten alive, grief, loss, betrayal, isolation, or madness. If you look closely enough, they're all found within The Descent. One layer, and often the most common interpretation, is that The Descent is a study of grief and loss. More specifically, Sarah's grief and loss. In the opening of the film, she loses both her husband and daughter in a tragic car accident. We see that there is already a distance between Sarah and her husband Paul. We discover that this is because Paul is in fact having an affair with Sarah's friend Juno, and that perhaps Sarah is ignorant to the affair because of her focus on her daughter. Her daughter is clearly a defining relationship for her, and one of the last conversations she has with her family is about planning her daughter's upcoming birthday, a fact that becomes important later in the film. Before the accident, Sarah senses that Paul is distracted and even says to him, "You seem distant." Distance is another important factor in The Descent, both physically and emotionally. There's a wonderful scene when Sarah wakes up in the hospital. We see her wander out into an empty corridor and she begins running from the darkness caused by the lights going out. This is Sarah literally running away from the oncoming darkness that is the pain of her grief. At first, Sarah appears to be alone in the corridor, but then we realise that it's actually full of people, including her friends Juno and Beth. But Sarah is alone in her pain and can't see the people around her until she literally runs into Beth, who holds Sarah as she collapses in screams of pain. Sarah is now emotionally distanced from the people around her. Rolling with this idea, you could then consider that the tunnels and darkness of the cave that end up physically separating the 6 women actually represent Sarah's emotional separation from her friends. The caves within the film create the feeling of being trapped, confined, and eventually isolated and cut off from others. These are also sensations you can feel because of emotions such as grief, loss, and anxiety. When Beth and Sarah arrive at the cabin, Juno asks Beth how Sarah is, to which Beth replies,
"Well, she's here. One step at a time, eh?"
We can infer that Sarah simply being there is an achievement in itself, and that it's been a rare occurrence in the last year. More evidence for this can be found in Sarah's later conversations with her friends. It's clear that she hasn't been in touch for a while as she's asking questions about the status of studying, jobs, and relationships. Sarah has cut herself off, seemingly wanting to deal with things alone or just not deal with them at all. We see evidence of this when Juno speaks to her in the caves, and Sarah shuts it down, claiming she's fine and she isn't going to break. We see it again when Sarah becomes trapped in a small passage and begins to have a panic attack. When Beth tries to help her, Sarah appears aggravated by it. She becomes defensive and snappy when offered help. But when Beth becomes forceful and says, quote, "The worst thing that could have happened to you has already happened and you're still here. There's nothing left to be afraid of, I promise." Sarah eventually accepts her help and gets out safely. While the tunnels represent Sarah's emotional separation, could then the crawlers represent her own personal demons? And is Sarah fighting the crawlers her finally facing up to and fighting the grief, the pain, and eventually Juno's betrayal? When Sarah comes across Beth injured and dying, she also in this moment discovers that Juno had had an affair with her husband. This is, in effect, Sarah losing her husband for a second time, losing the man that he was to her, and losing her friend. It's mere moments later that Sarah kills 2 crawlers, runs and falls into a pit of blood, is completely submerged, re-emerges covered in blood and removes her caving jacket. It's almost as if she is shedding some of who she is or who she was clinging onto. This could be a physical representation of her finally submerging herself in her pain and grief, unable to ignore it any longer, and now being willing to face it and fight it. But there is another way to interpret the events within the caves, and that is that the caves actually depict Sarah's descent into madness. It's an interesting idea that the deeper the women go into the cave is actually Sarah descending into madness, and the many tunnels and twisting corners of the cave are actually Sarah's fragmented psyche. Consider that when the tunnel passage collapses, trapping them, and the women begin to argue, the very next thing they come across is a dark, deep cavern. The timing makes it easy to believe that this is a symbol of Sarah feeling as though she's standing on the edge of an abyss. Another point I picked up on is when Becca, Sam and Juno hear Sarah scream. They believe that she has been killed, and Becca says there's nothing we can do for her now. But this could also be interpreted as them saying Sarah's mental health is too fractured, there's nothing they can do to help her. And the final evidence that Sarah has descended into madness is the threaded images throughout the film of Sarah's daughter blowing out candles on her birthday cake. We first see this while Sarah is unconscious in the hospital. We then see it twice in the caves when Sarah has been knocked out. This is an important image as it ties into Sarah's last conversation and moments with her daughter. But while on these previous occasions Sarah was unconscious, the final time we see it is in the movie's final moments, and Sarah is now fully conscious, but still smiles as she sees her daughter before her. Perhaps this is simply a coping mechanism to help distance herself from the situation. Her brain has just detached from reality in order to survive. To further explore this idea, you could go so far as to ask, are the crawlers real? Or is Sarah actually the villain? Consider that in the beginning it is only Sarah who ever hears and sees the crawlers. It is also only Sarah who sees one on the camcorder, and it is instantly after this that the attacks begin. What if the women are never attacked by crawlers, but are in fact attacked by Sarah? As I said before, Sarah has cut herself off emotionally from her friends and is clearly irritated by their attempts to help. And we know Sarah is capable of attacking the women after we see her violently attack Juno with a pickaxe and leave her for dead. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine she killed the others in her descent into madness. But to be fair, you could argue that all the women are villains in the film. I mean, if we believe the crawlers are real and look at it from their point of view, then these 6 women came into the crawlers' habitat and began attacking them and killing their children. Over the years, and decades now I suppose, The Descent has been thought of and considered an empowering feminist movie. Aside from the husband who is killed off very quickly, the film has an all-female cast of characters. And while the final girl has been ever present in our horror movies since the 1960s, we rarely find an all-female cast. Even if we have one, they often tend to be written to embody femininity. Think A Sleepover in Slumber Party Massacre or Sorority Sisters in House on Sorority Row. In The Descent, while we have 6 lead women, they don't necessarily follow the feminine blueprint. For example, take their bonding activity of choice. It's not a girls' night out, it's not a spa weekend. They go for a caving trip, which is obviously an activity enjoyed by all genders and sexes, but certainly has a masculine undertone to it. Consider the fact that the outfits are very unisex and the tools such as pickaxes have a violent aspect to them. But while The Descent does go against some stereotypes, it hasn't gone full swing to the other side of the spectrum where we have superhero boss girls. This is a very grounded in reality portrayal of women. It was important to Neil Marshall to portray these women in a real way. Apparently, when writing them, he would speak to and consult with his sister and female friends to see if the things the women were saying and how they were reacting in certain situations rang true. What Marshall has managed to do in The Descent is give the audience likeable women who are both strong and brave. You know, brave in the fact that they go caving, an extreme sport of sorts, but also brave in facing the crawlers, but then also in facing up to things like grief and loss. But they're very much human, and we see them feel fear and make mistakes. They abandon friends, they lie, they argue, and they take stupid risks in a dangerous environment. What's interesting is that we also see them be vicious and violent. Think of Juno and Sarah attacking the crawlers. They're picking out eyes and smashing in heads all over the place. But then Sarah also puts a pickaxe in Juno's leg, disabling her. And this is an act done purely out of anger, spite, and revenge. Not exactly traits we usually see in our final girls. In a MovieWeb article written by Sophie Collins, she says that we can tend to underestimate women's abilities, and that the women of The Descent are great examples of how women can survive alone without the need of a man rescuing them. I think you can even extend further on that and say that this is a great example of how women underestimate women. We see it with Sarah and her friends. They worry that she's fragile and will break, yet she ends up being the one left at the end. Probably not for very long, but the fact is she survived longer than the others. Outside of our final girl Sarah, Juno is probably the most fascinating character, and one that goes the most against stereotypes. Juno, like Sarah, could also be read as a bit of an anti-hero. She is actually the cause of everything that happens in the movie. In the beginning of the film, we discover that Juno is having an affair with her best friend Sarah's husband Paul, and it is actually this fact which causes the tragic car accident in which Paul and Sarah's daughter lose their lives. Paul is distant and distracted while driving because of Juno, which leads to the crash. Juno is the one who both organises the caving trip, but who also then lies to the other 5 women about their location and which caves they're in. Juno causes both Sarah's grief and trauma and the women being trapped in the caves and subsequently picked off by the crawlers. Juno's character is one who is almost unisex, reminiscent of Ellen Ripley in Alien. Her clothing throughout is unisex and her personality is quite dominant and very confident. In the opening scene, we see Juno being very loud and showboating to the others. Later in the movie, she declares, "I've never been lost in my life," showing herself to be very self-assured. But later we hear Becca declare that, quote, "This isn't caving, it's an ego trip," end quote. One of the friends, Beth, we discover was aware of the affair between Juno and Paul, and when the women become trapped in the cave, Beth calls Juno a selfish bitch and liar. She confronts her for leaving Sarah when she needed her, to which Juno replies, quote, "We all lost something in that crash," end quote, which, to me, is an interesting thing to say when the woman who lost her husband and daughter in the crash is stood mere feet away. But this is an example of how Juno is unable to lose face. Beth's right, Juno is a liar. She lies about the affair, she lies about the cave, and later she lies about Beth. After the crawlers attack, Juno, while in a heightened state of survival, accidentally kills Beth with a pickaxe through the throat. Now that's not the worst part. It's the fact that she never speaks to Beth or tries to help her. She simply backs away, leaving Beth to die. This is the pattern. Juno creates a situation and leaves when she can't deal with what is happening. There's a nice scene towards the beginning of the movie when the women reunite, and Sarah thanks Sam for the lovely letter she sent after the accident, showing her support, but also apologising for not being able to make the funeral due to midterm exams. While Sarah is saying it was okay that she wasn't there, Juno interrupts and changes the subject. We can infer that this is out of guilt for her own absence and inability to apologise or take responsibility for it. In some ways, Juno is very similar to Sarah. Both of them are hiding from truths that they can't face. Although, when the crawlers attack, we see a difference in how these two women initially behave. While Sarah is calm and quiet, Juno is loud, frantic, and panicked. But as we said earlier, this is due to the fact that Sarah has been separated from her friends for a long time by this point, emotionally. But Juno doesn't remain a damsel in distress for very long. Once she becomes focused on killing the crawlers, she gains control once more. But Juno's comeuppance for her deceit and actions is to meet a fate that mirrors that of Beth. with a pickaxe through her skin and left to die by someone who was supposed to be a friend. One last point that I want to make before we finish is another consideration for the events in the cave. Remember that while the 6 women were walking to the entrance of the cave, one of them, Becca, was reminding the women of and listing the potential dangers they would face in the caves. Things such as dehydration, drowning, claustrophobia, but also hallucinations. As I mentioned earlier, by the time the women cross paths with the crawlers, they've already been through many layers of hell. They're scared, they're injured, they're breaking down and turning on each other. Who's to say that the crawlers aren't just a group hallucination, or the hallucination of one person, Sarah, and the others in their state of fear are swayed to think the same? A little bit like folie à deux, a shared psychosis. So there you have it, guys, a deep dive into the tunnels and darkness within the descent. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, maybe give it a little thumbs up, and don't forget to check out my Monsters 101 episode on the crawlers if you haven't already. I will leave a link to it both here and in the description box below. As always, don't forget to leave me your thoughts below as well. Are there any themes or deeper messages you've picked up on which I haven't spoken about? Let me know and we can have a chat about this incredible movie. I'm not sure what my next episode will be, but I think I'm going to do another Monsters 101, and I just want to say a quick thank you for all of your wonderful and positive comments and responses to my first episode in that series. It really means a lot, so thank you guys. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.